Hey there, friends. David Lightbringer here, and guess what? I've got good news. I think I found Bran the Builder. I wasn't really looking for him, but while making my Nightfort video, thank you for watching everyone, I had a bit of a brainwave and realized that I think I know where Bran the Builder is and what happened to him, and in part, how he built the wall. So I know this sounds kind of nuts, but I think Bran the Builder is the Black Gate, as in the talking weirwood face buried beneath a Nightfort whose mouth opens to reveal a tunnel system that goes beneath the wall. I think that face is what became of Bran the Builder. I think he merged with the weirwood organism at the Nightfort as a part of his building the wall, which was done, I believe, through harnessing the power of that Nightfort weirwood. I'm actually embarrassed that I didn't figure this out sooner, because Bran the Blessed of Welsh folklore, which is a big influence on both Bran the Builder and young Bran Stark and a few other things in A Song of Ice and Fire, well, Bran the Blessed's head, his still talking head, gets buried in the ground beneath the Tower of London, which is actually a fortress, and it's buried facing south for all time to guard England from invasion. That's right, friends, this is a real theory. It has legs. Bran the Builder got buried beneath the Nightfort and became the weirwood face, bravely sacrificing himself to raise the wall, yet condemning himself to live at the bottom of the well as a big face. And like the mythical head of Bran the Blessed, sorry, not mythical, it's definitely really under there, the talking weirwood face that I think is Bran the Builder faces south and guards the realms, both north and south, from unauthorized access, shall we say. There's a lot more to it than that, obviously. We got a whole video to go, but yeah, that's the gist of it. So if that sounds good to you, then go ahead and click that thumbs up button to help raise this channel to new heights like Bran the Builder raising the wall. Brandon Ice Eyes. All right, so we're told that Bran the Builder raised the wall with the help of giants and children of the forest, with the idea being that the giants are big and strong and can haul big cubes of ice to stack them up to build a wall, to cut themselves off from the rest of Westeros. But let me just say, that is kind of stupid, for several reasons. One, the wall is clearly made of magic. It couldn't stand up on its own. It would just collapse. So clearly there is magic holding it together. And like I said, the building of the wall amounts to a theft from the giants and the children of the forest of their ancestral lands, as is recorded in the famous song, Last of the Giants.
Oh, the small folk have stolen my forests. They've stolen my rivers and hills. And they've built a great wall through my valleys. And they've fished all the fish from my rills.
Thank you. Thank you. And there is, of course, theories about children of the forest or human skin changers enslaving giants through body-snatching skin changer magic. So maybe they forced them to build the wall. But again, I say that the wall is built of magic, and that seems pretty obvious. After all, it is set with magical wards that keep out the dead and the White Walkers. And there's that very ominous line from Ygritte about the wall being built with blood, which means some kind of blood magic, potentially blood sacrifice to the weirwoods. And one of those blood sacrifices may have been Bran the Builder himself, although technically he's kind of still around, like I said, at the bottom of the well, blind, just kind of waiting for somebody to knock on the door with the right passcode. So the point is, the wall is built out of ice and magic, seemingly. So it's always seemed like the builders of the wall would either be the others, who can do things with ice that no one else can, or perhaps some sort of human ice wizard like Melisandre, but with ice, and not necessarily female, just a human ice wizard, probably a Stark. And there are, of course, a lot of clues about this. So down in the crypts of Winterfell, where we find the Kings of Winter, there's a couple of fellows that seem to imply Starks might occasionally be made of ice or be able to wield ice magic. Namely, Brandon Ice Eyes Stark and Edric Snowbeard Stark. Edric Snowbeard was the one who raised the outer wall of Winterfell, so I've always taken that as a clue, or at least since I found the clue, that it may have been a snow-bearded Stark, an icy Stark, who raised the wall. And that would obviously be Brandon the Builder. And Edric Snowbeard obviously isn't named Brandon, but that name Edric is a name that seems to be connected to the last hero via Eldric Shadow Chaser and some other clues in House Dayne and House Stark. And obviously there could be a very close relationship between the last hero and Brandon the Builder. And then as for Brandon Ice Eyes Stark, well, he's got the same name as Brandon the Builder, and if he's got ice eyes, well, there's really only one way to get Ice Eyes. And just to be clear, I'm not saying that Edric Snowbeard or Brandon Ice Eyes were actually ice wizards, just that their names are clues about Starks having been ice wizards in the ancient past. Now, the cool thing about Brandon Ice Eyes, besides his name, which is pretty cool, is that he has this really awesome story that's tied to the Wolf's Den, the old black fortress that existed before the new city of White Harbor, at the mouth of the White Knife, where White Harbor was later built. So if you remember, Davos was imprisoned in the Wolf's Den, the Black Castle, which is dominated by this huge weirwood crashing through the walls and all that. And there's this super crusty storytelling jailer named Sir Bartimus, and he's telling Davos the story of Brandon Ice Eyes. So apparently at the end of Edric Snowbeard's very, very long reign, he began to slip a little bit, and the treasons sprang up like weeds. And one of those treasons was some slavers from the Three Sisters who came and seized the Wolf's Den and started doing slavery stuff. And by slaver stuff, as you can see on the screen, we mean branding their captives with hot irons and breaking them to the whip and then shipping them to foreign lands to do hard labor for the rest of their lives, however long that may be.
Then a long, cruel winter fell, said Sir Bartimus. The White Knife froze hard, and even the firth was icing up. The winds came howling from the north and drove them slavers inside to huddle round their fires. And whilst they warmed themselves, the new king come down on them. Brandon Stark this was, Edric Snowbeard's great-grandson, him that men called Ice Eyes. He took the Wolf's Den back, stripped the slavers naked, and gave them to the slaves he'd found chained up in the dungeons. It said they hung their entrails in the branches of the heart tree as an offering to the gods. The old gods, not these new ones from the south. Your seven don't know winter. Winter don't know them.
So that was obviously Nimbledick's cousin, Sir Bartimus, and the point of the story is essentially symbolism. We have an old black castle, a stronghold of the First Men, built around a giant weirwood, just like at the Night Fort, and it's taken over by enemies, by slavers, who I assume would represent the others, who obviously enslave people in the army of the dead. Then comes our hero, Brandon Ice Eyes Stark, and I believe that line about the White Knife freezing solid is a reference to Dawn, the sword Dawn of House Dane. Obviously, it's a very good candidate to have been the Dragonsteel sword of the last hero, and obviously there's a good chance that the last hero with his dog was actually a Stark. So there's some sort of story about how the last hero used Dawn and then gave it to the Danes, which I did my best to explain in Dawn is the Original Ice, Part 1 and 2. But basically, yeah, the Starks have this naming tradition of calling all their swords ice. Even though their current Valyrian steel sword is only 400 years old, the naming tradition goes back to the Age of Heroes. And if you think about it, the last hero wielding Dawn, a big white sword that is unbreakable, even impervious to the cold of the others, well, it looks like the coldest thing around, a big stick of ice, an ice sword. And so taken together with the name Brandon Ice Eyes, the last hero may have been a Stark wielding Dawn and even channeling ice magic through it, if you want to get nuts. And then, of course, at the end of the Brandon Ice Eyes story, we notice that he makes sacrifice to the old gods. So this helps us identify his symbolic role of an old gods worshipping Stark last hero, potentially. So this Brandon Ice Eyes sounds a lot like Brandon the Breaker, who ended the 13-year rule of Knights King and Queen at the Night Fort. Now, as to how these ancient Starks may have gained the ability to wield ice magic, they may have just come about it naturally in the way that Melisandre learned to use fire magic, but I do have a theory called the Blood of the Other, which proposes that the last hero may have rescued a child of Knights King and Queen that was meant to be given to the others, just like Sam and Gilly rescue baby monster that was supposed to be given to the others, and that this last hero baby, this icy baby, was taken to Winterfell and raised as a Stark, and that would give the Starks the Blood of the Other in the same way that the Targaryens have the Blood of the Dragon, which would be a really cool symmetry. And yeah, it's a whole thing. I need to make a new video about that, actually. My Blood of the Other videos are very old, but check out A New Night's King. That's actually got a newer version of that theory. So to sum up what I just said, Bran the Builder, in order to build the wall, probably needs to have been an ice wizard, and he very well could have been one. Heart Tree of the Wall. Okay, so in the first Night Fort video, again, thanks for watching, I proposed that the Night Fort may actually predate the wall. And at the very latest, it would have been built as the beginning of the wall was being built, simply because you need a base of operations, but more importantly, because the Night Fort is very obviously built around the weirwood organism. Weirwoods live forever, so they are presumably very old, and pretty much all the oldest First Men castles are built around weirwoods. So that means that the location of the Night Fort was determined by the pre-existing location of the weirwood organism, and thus the location of the wall itself was probably determined by the fact that there was this weirwood organism there and potentially other weirwood or weirwood I say organism because we don't know what it is. And the talking face does seem unique. But in any case, there may be other weirwoods under the wall. And that would imply that the wall was built using the magic of these weirwoods, at least for the wards, if not for the actual raising of the wall itself. So in that last Night Fort video, I mentioned the line from Melisandre from the deleted A Feast for Crows draft about the Night Fort being the heart of your wall. And the heart of the Night Fort is the heart tree that's there. Then Melisandre also says, we walk beneath one of the hinges of the world, referring to the wall, and says that great was the lore that raised it. So if the Night Fort is the oldest castle on the wall and it's the heart of the wall, then it probably had a lot to do with raising the wall. This would be where Bran the Builder was standing, if he was standing anywhere when he did his magic. And so, if weirwoods were used in the building of the wall, then that would necessitate or imply that Bran the Builder was a green seer. And indeed, one of the legends we have about Bran the Builder is that he was taken to a secret place and taught the language of the children of the forest. And given that we've seen young Bran Stark taken to a secret place to learn the magic of the children of the forest by becoming a green seer, seems clear that this is what is being alluded to, unless you think the children took Bran the Builder to a cave to teach him birdsong. That would be kind of silly. Furthermore, we have 6 skin changers in the current generation of the Starks, with one of them being a green seer. So obviously the green gifts run strong in the bloodline of House Stark, and that implies that some of the ancient Starks would be skin changers and green seers too. So Bran the Builder probably needs to have been a green seer as well as an ice wizard to raise the wall, and it is strongly implied that he was. All right, so now that we've got the ice and fire basics of this theory down, Bran the Builder, potentially a green seer, potentially an ice wizard, potentially working at the Night Fort to raise the wall, it's time to talk about Bran the Blessed and his giant talking head. Bran's got a girlfriend who's better than that. She is a giant tree. Wah, wah. So we did the longer version of the Bran the Blessed myth in the King Bran iceberg stream, which I recommend checking out if you want that. But the very, very, very short version of the King Bran the Blessed myth is that Bran the Blessed, whose name means Blessed Raven, he was a giant and also a king of Celtic Britain, which just means before the Romans and before the Saxons. Pretty much all Welsh myth is going to be set in that time period. The most famous part of Bran the Blessed's story is probably the cauldron, Bran the Blessed's cauldron that revives the dead. And of course, the Gundestrup cauldron is thought to be partially based on this story. One of the panels on the Gundestrup cauldron appears to depict the Bran the Blessed story. It's this one with the giant head. And that seems to have translated into A Song of Ice and Fire as the weirwood bowl, the bowl of weirwood paste that Bran eats not to revive himself, but to gain access to eternal life through the weirwoods. So that's pretty similar. And of course, the weirwood bowl even has faces around the side, very like the Gundestrup cauldron. So King Bran the Blessed, he has a sister named Branwen, because we have our own names at Winterfell, and Branwen's name means White Raven, which kind of makes you think of the Night's Queen, since the White Raven is a signal of the arrival of winter in Ice and Fire. And that's interesting because obviously Bran the Builder, the last hero, all these people have some sort of connection to Night's Queen. We don't know what the exact family tree is there, but Night's Queen may have been a Stark. So in any case, Bran the Blessed's sister, Branwen, White Raven, she marries the King of Ireland, so she goes across the sea and goes to Ireland, but she is mistreated there. This is Welsh myth, so the Irish are the bad guys. Apologies. So Branwen, again, mistreated for years. They keep it a secret, but eventually she finds a starling that she gets to carry a message to King Bran. I don't know why it wasn't a raven, since Bran is associated with ravens, but it wasn't. It was a starling, and the starling carried the news to King Bran. Of course, he came to rescue his sister, and there were battles, and there was a pact, and then there was a dinner, and some double crossing, and many more murders, and basically at the end of it, Bran the Blessed's forces are successful, but Branwen dies, her son dies, and Bran the Blessed himself is wounded by a spear in the heel, very like Achilles. But being a giant and being magical, he just tells his men to cut his head off, and that it will keep talking, which it does for another 7 years. Bran's men sail back to a place called Castle Harlech, where they sort of just chill and have a retreat for about 7 years, again listening to the very entertaining talking Bran the Blessed head. And Castle Harlech is one of these enchanted places where time runs different and they kind of forget about going back to their real lives. But eventually they do. They go back to London. They bury Bran the Blessed's head under the Tower of London, which is actually a fortress and not just a tower. So kind of like the Night Fort is a fortress. And to this day, a rookery is in fact kept at the Tower of London in honor of this myth, in honor of Bran the Blessed. And the presence of ravens is looked at as a sign of the presence of Bran the Blessed. So, was Bran the Builder buried as a big head beneath the Night Fort to eternally guard the realms of men facing south, where he is attended by ravens and crows, the crows of the Night's Watch, and the ravens that they send as messengers? And just as Bran the Blessed is a giant, the Black Gate is a giant head. It's so big that when its mouth opens, Hodor can walk through it with Bran on his shoulders, of course, bumping Bran's head against the lip of the door. But I estimate that at least an 8-foot mouth, so it's a giant head. And Bran the Blessed is a giant. So pretty good correlation here. And as we discussed in our recent Giants live stream, me and Sean, aka Hero with 1,000 Voices, go give him a sub, there is a lot of giant symbolism that is attached to the weirwoods. I'll put a couple of these quotes on the screen, but the most important one is the description of the Winterfell heart tree as a pale giant frozen in time. So did Bran the Builder become a giant weirwood head, which is frozen in time in the sense that he is an eternal part of the weirwood organism? Perhaps. Some people are saying. Then we have the expression waking giants in the earth, which of course is a euphemism for earthquakes, but it's specifically associated with the Horn of Joramun and its power to bring down the wall. But if the weirwoods are pale giants, frozen in time and buried in the earth, then the way that we might bring the wall down by waking giants in the earth could involve the weirwood organisms, like the one at the Night Fort, given a little shimmy beneath the wall, or just releasing the magic spell that holds it all together. So again, we go back to Melisandre saying that the Night Fort is the heart of the wall, and the idea that the Night Fort weirwood might have been used to raise the wall. And yeah, it seems possible that waking giants in the earth to bring down the wall could involve this same weirwood. You know, if it made the wall, perhaps it can unmake it by, again, doing a little shimmy. And then one other cool detail from the Bran the Blessed story, he is a giant that is so big that he actually can't fit on a boat and just wades across the channel to Ireland. And you can see the very amusing art here of that event. And then later in Ireland, he has to lay down across a river to become a bridge so his men can cross. So given that the Night Fort and the Black Gate serve as a bridge between the realms, we have to again ask the question, did Bran the Builder lay down and become a weirwood bridge, even as he raised the wall, which is the division between the realms? So it turns out Bran the Builder is not the only place where George references the legend of Bran the Blessed. We get a very, very strong reference to Bran the Blessed at the castle known as the Whispers. That's the old ruined castle of House Crab that sits at the end of Cracklaw Point. You may remember it from the Brienne chapter where she fights Shagwell the Fool beneath the weirwood, and where Nimble Dick Crab meets his tragic and valiant end and is then buried beneath the weirwood tree. Here is the description of that weirwood tree. In their midst was a pale stranger, a slender young weirwood with a trunk as white as a cloistered maid. Dark red leaves sprouted from its reaching branches. So this weirwood is very similar to the one at the Night Fort. It's a natural growth weirwood, just popping up on its own. It doesn't have a face. It's skinny and young, and it is described as reaching. Remember, at the Night Fort, and we'll read this description later, the Night Fort weirwood is reaching for both the sun and the moon. And this white weirwood being described as pale as a cloistered maid and also as a stranger definitely makes me think of Night's Queen, who is as pale as the moon. So the castle of House Crab, which became known as the Whispers, is itself very similar to the Night Fort, simply because it's a ruined castle built around a weirwood, and because there are a lot of ghostly whispers. We get a ton of that at the Night Fort with the skittering leaves and Bran thinking of the 79 Sentinels. And here at the Whispers, we have a whole legend to explain the whispering sound that goes on there.
His wife was a woods witch. Whenever Sir Clarence killed a man, he'd fetch his head back home, and his wife would kiss it on the lips and bring it back to life. Lords they were, and wizards, and famous knights and pirates. One was a king of Duskendale. They gave old Crab good counsel. Being they was just heads, they couldn't talk real loud, but they never shut up neither. When you're a head, talking's all you got to pass the day, so Crab's Keep got named the Whispers. Still is, though it's been a ruin for 1,000 years. The lonely place, the Whispers.
A haunted castle just isn't a haunted castle without a good storyteller to tell its ghost stories, whether that be Old Nan in the Night Fort or Nimble Dick in the Whispers. And I'm sorry if you didn't see that coming and don't know how we do the nimble dick voice around here, but that's how we do it. So Brienne does eventually figure out that it's not talking heads down there, but rather just the sound of the sea washing in and out of the caves, which sort of pockmark the cliffs there. Those are probably weirwood caves, such as we find under every weirwood tree, and there is probably a bigger weirwood organism down there. But yeah, there's no heads, just the sound of the sea. But obviously the talking heads are a reference to Bran the Blessed and his buried talking head, and given that this is a weirwood tree setup, it seems pretty clear that George's version of Bran the Blessed's head under the ground is the idea of green seers under the ground, because they continue to talk as well as guard the realms. They also give advice in your dreams. You know, it's kind of confusing, but yeah, that's essentially what the Whispers show us, that the legend of Bran the Blessed translates into Ice and Fire as green seers sitting in caves beneath castles. And then there's also the green sea wordplay here. Hopefully you've heard me talk about this before. Shout out Ravenous Reader. But basically this is a pun that George has constructed. The green seers are swimming in a sort of cosmic ocean of time and space, and that ocean is the green sea. It's where the green seers swim. And this ties back to Bloodraven's quote about the river of time and how the weirwoods actually act as a weir, as a sort of wooden dam that's across the river of time that isn't moved by the river. And what this means is that the sound of the sea in the weirwood caves is really just another way of saying the sound of the green sea and the talk of the green seers, which is what the talking heads are supposed to represent. And then finally, I just want to point out that Nimble Dick Crab, who answers Brienne's skepticism about the heads by saying, "No, it's not, it's heads," or something like that. Nimble Dick is, again, buried beneath the weirwood tree, but that's the weirwood tree of his ancestor, Sir Clarence Crab. And so if the Black Gate at the Night Fort is Bran the Builder, then we have a weirwood organism, Bran the Builder, eating his descendant, just like Nimble Dick Crab is eaten by the weirwood tree of his ancestor. And we'll come back to this theme of eating your descendants at the end of the video when we talk about the rat cook. All right, so we did one mythical Bran and his voyage across the sea. How about two? That's kind of the theme of the King Bran stories. And this one will be from Irish myth. This is the story of Bran Mac Fabel, who is kind of like the counterpart in Irish folklore to Bran the Blessed from Welsh folklore, because Irish and Welsh folklore are both branches of Celtic folklore, which means that they share a recent common ancestor and then developed on their own a bit. So yeah, there's a lot of parallels. They're not the same. There's a lot of parallels, and both Bran stories involve a voyage across the sea. That's kind of the thing. So Bran Mac Fabel, like Bran the Blessed, is also a king and also a giant. He's the king of Ireland, of course, because this is Irish myth. So King Bran, he's walking in the hills of his realm in the springtime, and he hears some beautiful, enchanting music, and it turns into a vision of a beautiful woman, a fey woman. And she's described as being draped in silver that shone like the moon's reflection on water, her eyes deeper than the abyss and older than time. That's a description that very obviously reminds us of the others and Night's Queen. Night's Queen with her skin as pale as the moon, and obviously she's a strange fey woman that comes out of the woods and enchants Night's King. And then, of course, the very first description of the others also uses that language of the moon's reflection on the water, with the others and Night's Queen both being older than time, or, you know, at least a few thousand years old, which is just as good. So this fairy woman, she's so magical that she doesn't even talk normally. She speaks in song, and this is called the music of the trees. And she tells Bran the Blessed of this enchanted isle across the sea called the Isle of Women, basically the Isle of Fairy Women. And who wouldn't want to go there? So yeah, Bran Mac Fabel, he does want to go there, and after this vision, it's all he can think about for years. Everything else loses its savor, and he just wants to go to the Isle of Fairy Women. So he assembles a crew, 3 different ships, and they sail west from Ireland into a magical place where all the islands are enchanted, and it's very Voyage of Prince Caspian, Narnia-like. And eventually they get there to the Isle of Women. There's a lot that happens in between, but they eventually get there. They stay there for a while. And like at Castle Harlech, time runs differently on the Isle of Women, so they're not aware of how long they stay there. And eventually, Bran Mac Fabel remembers that he's a king and has responsibilities and stuff. And some of the other people are homesick. So they go ahead and sail home, but they are warned not to step foot on the land, because basically it turns out that what has happened is that hundreds of years have passed, and Bran Mac Fabel has become a myth in his own land. So they sail up to the shore, and he has this conversation with someone on the shore and learns that, yeah, he's become a legend of a king that sailed off west and was never seen again. He sailed to the other world and never came back. So one of Bran's crew does attempt to set foot on land. He instantly turns to dust, becomes centuries old on the spot. It's kind of a movie trope. This may be where it came from. And Bran Mac Fabel, having learned a ton of stuff from the fairies, he writes everything down in a book. And he tosses it to shore to the people there and then sails away, presumably back to the Isle of Fairy Women. So there's a lot of potential ice and fire correlations here. Just starting with the last thing first, we know that Bran is going to be the final king in some sense in the books. And so very like he began writing down a book of true history on the show, I think that may happen at the end of Ice and Fire, where he takes all of his weirwood net true history and writes it down in a book and begins to give Westeros an actual accurate history. But that hasn't happened yet. That's just theoretical. So set that aside. George alludes to Bran Mac Fabel directly in the story of Brandon the Shipwright, who is a king of winter or a king in the north. I'm not sure which. But he built a fleet and sailed west across the Sunset Sea and was never seen again. So exactly the same as Bran Mac Fabel. And that makes us wonder, why is George referencing this myth? Is it because Bran the Builder visited the other world and never came back? Because he was buried under the Night Fort, it became a face gate. And because of the whole green seer metaphor that George has created, sailing across the sea to Otherworld is essentially the same thing as going to join the weirwood net, going to the weirwood caves, meeting up with the children of the forest who are the Fae in Ice and Fire, and entering a realm where time runs differently, and then sort of never coming back. So yeah, Bran the Builder may have sailed into the Green Sea and never returned, essentially. And maybe that secret place that he was taken to learn the language of the children of the forest could have been the caves at the Night Fort. And then finally, all of this Bran Mac Fabel and Brandon the Shipwright sailing to the Otherworld stuff is tied back to the plot of young Bran Stark, who hears Wyman Manderley come to Winterfell. I believe it's in the second book, maybe the first book, one or the other. It's at the Harvest Feast, and Wyman Manderley, if you recall, is proposing to Bran that they build a big fleet for the north. And Bran thinks about the story of Bran the Shipwright and gets excited, and he's like, oh, maybe I could be a ship captain. So young Bran wants to sail a ship like Brandon the Shipwright, and he may get the chance, of course. We talked about this in the last video, so I won't go into it at length. But the theory that Quinn's ideas and myself formulated about how Bran will return from Bloodraven's Cave is that Mira Reed will make a reed boat of sorts, as her Cranog men ancestors know how to do, so that she and Bran and probably Hodor can use the underground river down there at the bottom of that chasm to escape from Bloodraven's Cave. I think they're going to take that river all the way back to the Night Fort, which you'll remember has the well and there's water down there. And the reason why I think this is because there's a lot of symbolism about Hodor holding the door at the Night Fort, with that door being the Black Gate itself. So all this about Bran wanting to build a fleet and paralleling Brandon the Shipwright, who's like Bran Mac Fabel, may come full circle with Bran being sailed on a reed boat on the underground river back to the Night Fort to meet the face of his ancestor, Bran the Builder. And essentially, this is a very strange baby Moses in a reed basket kind of thing. So, yeah. All right, sticking with boats for a minute, we have Grey King, Black Gate, because the very first clues that the Black Gate used to be somebody is the Grey King. Why do I say that? Well, because the description of the Grey King and the Black Gate are basically the same. It was white weirwood, and there was a face on it. A glow came from the wood like milk and moonlight, so faint it scarcely seemed to touch anything beyond the door itself, not even Sam standing right before it. The face was old and pale, wrinkled and shrunken. It looks dead. Its mouth was closed, and its eyes. Its cheeks were sunken, its brow withered, its chin sagging. If a man could live for 1,000 years and never die but just grow older, his face might come to look like that. So that is exactly what the Grey King is said to have done. Lived for 1,000 years and never died, but just grown older. 1,000 years and 7. Don't forget the 7. And of course, the way that you live for 1,000 years and grow older but never die is by being a green seer and hooking up to a weirwood tree. And that's exactly what the Grey King seems to have done. For example, Grey King is said to have sat in a throne made from Naga's jaws and to have worn a crown, a tall, pale crown from Naga's teeth. However, Naga's bones turn out to be petrified weirwood. Those ribs that everyone thinks is a sea monster, they're actually the weirwood ribbing of an overturned boat. Because that's something that the Vikings did. They flipped over boats they weren't using anymore and turned them into long hauls. Or more often, they would build their long hauls using the same technique as they would use to build a boat hull. The Grey King is in fact flat out said to have carved the first longship from the demon tree Ig, which ate human flesh. And that's an obvious reference to Yggdrasil, which is the inspiration for the weirwood trees, which have big bloody mouths which consume human flesh and blood. It's usually just the blood, but remember at White Tree we found human bones in the weirwood mouth. So getting back to Grey King, if Naga's bones are really weirwood, then his throne and crown made from Naga's jaws and teeth become weirwood also. And that makes more sense, because green seers sit in weirwood thrones and they have the branches wrapping around their head just like a crown. And this may even be the inspiration for the driftwood crown of later Ironborn kings. It's a wooden crown that they wear, so perhaps an imitation of Grey King's weirwood roots. Grey King is also said to have possessed the living fire of this sea dragon, which turns out to be weirwood. And the living fire of the weirwood would, of course, be the magic of the weirwood. And you would possess the magic of the weirwood if you sat in a weirwood throne and let the roots wrap around your head for 1,000 years. So then we have the aspect of the Grey King's legend about him turning gray, his skin and hair and everything turned all gray, which makes him sound like a corpse and also kind of a statue. And those are two words that are used to describe Bloodraven, a grisly talking corpse and a strange twisted statue of wood and bone, I think it is. So the Grey King may have essentially turned to wood. He's there for 1,000 years. Bloodraven's only been there for 50 years. So his turning gray and statue-like, yeah, he could be turning to wood or even petrifying in place and turning to pale stone. And if that's what happens to green seers after 1,000 years, then this is probably also the truth of the deepest levels of the crypts of Winterfell. The upper levels have gray stone statues of Starks sitting on thrones, and I strongly suspect that the lowest levels will have green seer thrones. And being 8,000 years old, those green seers may very well have petrified all the way and turned to stone. And so the later stone statues would essentially be inspired by the petrified weirwood stone statues. That's all a little speculative, but the point is, the Black Gate, it makes sense that it's described like the Grey King, like a man living for 1,000 years and never dying, because the Grey King seems to have been a green seer who extended his lifespan by hooking up to a weirwood tree. And that's exactly what I think Bran the Builder did with the Black Gate. So the Grey King looks like the Black Gate, and he sounds like he was doing a Bloodraven thing for an even longer amount of time. And just as the Black Gate seems partially inspired by the Bran the Blessed buried head legend, the Grey King, like Brandon the Shipwright, seems to parallel Bran Mac Fabel. Because like the Irish King Bran, Grey King sailed from his homeland across the sea to a new land, and then never went back. Because remember, he came to the Iron Islands from across the Sunset Sea, at least that's what the legends say, and that's what we think is true after having done much research. And then just as Bran Mac Fabel sailed into the sea and was never seen again, supposedly the Grey King got up off of his throne after 1,000 years and 7 and walked into the sea. Now, I don't think he really did that, if indeed he had been sitting on the throne for 1,000 years. I don't think you can get up anymore. So this is probably a piece of fishy Deep One's folklore that's gotten attached to the Grey King's story. But the point is, it's a direct parallel to Bran Mac Fabel never coming back from sailing into the sea. And then getting back to the idea of Naga's bones being weirwood and also the beams and pillars and rafters of Grey King's Hall, what we have here is Grey King building a hall around weirwood pillars, and maybe Bran the Builder built a wall around weirwood pillars. And just as Grey King's Hall is compared to the sea dragon, the wall is of course many times compared to the ice dragon. All right, so we're going to close with the story of the Rat Cook. But before we do, I just want to say real quickly a word about Mimir's Well. I originally had a whole section on Mimir's Well that I cut out of the video because it's really not super relevant. But the one interesting thing that I did want to mention is that Mimir, which is a big head sitting by a well, definitely what the Black Gate and the Night Fort are partially inspired on. Mimir, the talking head by the well, used to be a person who had his head cut off, at least according to one story from Snorri Sturluson. So after his head was cut off, Odin actually carried it around for a long time so it could give him advice, kind of like the heads at the Whispers. That origin story from Mimir being beheaded is actually a later story. The head by the well is a very old Proto-Indo-European archetype. So we don't know if Odin carried the head around and then put it by the well, but the point is, according to one story, the decapitated head at the well, Mimir, used to be a person. So maybe the Black Gate also used to be a person. Maybe that person is Bran the Builder. So even before we get to the Rat Cook story, Bran is basically thinking of the Rat Cook all through the day. And we get these little tidbits like, oh, when he hears the rats, he assumes those must be the Rat Cook's children running from their father. Then later Summer, like a good boy, brings Bran a dead rat, but it's not the Rat Cook because it's gray and it's not nearly big enough. It's only as big as a cat, which is pretty big, but the Rat Cook rat is supposed to be as big as a sow. Then we get this passage where Bran is staring at the huge brick ovens, which he does not like, that surround them like open mouths. Then he looks at the butcher's block and says, that's where the Rat Cook chopped up the princes to pieces, and he must have baked the pie in one of these ovens. And then finally we get the Rat Cook story proper. So as you can see, the Rat Cook cooks the son of an Andal king in a big pie with lots of tasty garnishings, including bacon, because you always gotta have bacon to cover up the taste of long pig, as they say. He serves the prince and bacon pie to his father, who praised the taste and had a second slice. Afterward, the gods transformed the cook into a monstrous white rat who could only eat his own young, so that's a pretty bad curse. And he's roamed the Night Fort ever since, devouring his children, but still his hunger was not sated.
It was not for murder that the gods cursed him, nor for serving the Andal king his son in a pie. A man has a right to vengeance, but he slew a guest beneath his roof, and that the gods cannot forgive.
So there you have it, the story of the Rat Cook. And to me and many others, this has always seemed like it's talking about the weirwood trees. When you think of a giant white rat, you think of a white rat with red eyes. It's an albino rat. And of course, the weirwoods are white and giant and they have red eyes. The weirwood trees eat their descendants in a way because the first green seers hooked up to the trees will later be drinking the blood sacrifice of their descendants. And then when we go to the Night Fort, we specifically have the idea of the Black Gate. If that was Bran the Builder, he very literally eats his descendant because Bran goes through the mouth. And this is where I'll bring up Nimble Dick Crab again, who was fed to the weirwood of his ancestors at Cracklaw Point. So yeah, the Black Gate, aka Bran the Builder, eating his descendant, Brandon Stark, and that may be why the drop of water that falls from the Black Gate's lip onto Bran's forehead is salty as a tear. Bran the Builder is weeping for the fact that he has to consume yet another one of his descendants. And of course, if people at the Night Fort have been feeding snow babies through the Black Gate to the others, which is something we talked about in the Night Fort video, then it may be that Bran the Builder of the Black Gate has consumed many of his descendants. And this would be the meaning of the Rat Cook story. So did Bran the Builder have to do something dishonorable, some sort of violation of guest right, in order to raise the wall and defeat the others? It seems like that may be the case. And then finally, going back to Bran's name, it doesn't just mean raven, of course. Bran is also the outer skin of a kernel of wheat, which is a seed. George is using this symbolism very heavily in Bran's plot when he's always offering and trying to feed corn to the ravens. That's a symbol of Bran giving his seed, or his fertility and future, giving all of that up to the weirwood net to be used as an instrument of the green seers. And then Bran, the seed, is planted underground in the north so that he can grow to maturity in time to help bring the spring and bloom in the spring. So we have to ask the question, was Bran the Builder also planted underground to help keep winter at bay? Did Bran the Builder offer himself to the weirwood organism at the Night Fort, just as his descendant Brandon Stark did? So there you have it, that's the theory, and if this theory is true, those first Night's Watchmen who were all giving their oaths at the Night Fort to the weirwood tree would have essentially been swearing to Bran the Builder himself. And that's pretty cool. So thanks a lot, friends. Leave a comment. Let me know what you think. It's a little bit of a crazy theory, but yeah, I think Bran the Builder became the Black Gate. And so there's my Bran the Builder video. And thanks a lot for tuning in. And if you're interested in supporting the channel, we have beefed up our Patreon campaign with t-shirt giveaways and access to secret streams and all kinds of other good stuff. So check out the link below the description of the video. I would be most appreciative. And with that said, I will see you next Sunday at 1 p.m. Pacific, 4 p.m. Eastern for the next Starry Wisdom Sunday live stream. Cheers, friends, and I'll see you next time.